Hi everyone, my name is Liz Needham. I'm the communication coach at Rockborne, and I'm really excited to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes talking to you a little bit about data storytelling, which is a bit of a buzzword in the data space at the moment. So data storytelling is probably one of the most desired skill sets by employers, but actually it's probably the most overlooked skill set when you talk to data professionals. So in this session, I want to talk to you about what is data storytelling, why is it important for you in your roles, and how can you actually implement it into your data analysis. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Liz, as I've said. I'm originally from North Yorkshire, but I've moved to London 6 years ago now. And my academic background is mostly in psychology and organizational psychology, and my career history involves coaching, mentoring, and training. I'm currently the communication coach at Rockborne. I'm responsible for training our consultants in all of their interpersonal skills required to be a successful data person. So professionalism, stakeholder management, assertiveness, and of course, data storytelling. So the content you'll see today is actually a short snippet of some of the content that I teach our consultants. So if you're interested to learn more about that, please do get in touch and I'm happy to share more information. So a little bit about Rockborne for anyone who's not aware. The purpose of Rockborne is to bring more diverse talent into the data industry. And we do this by recruiting talented graduates. We take them through a 12-week data program, and then we connect them with companies across the UK. So our training includes technical training, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also business acumen and communication skills, which is what I cover. We also offer bespoke training programs for our customers, and I'll show you a little bit about that now. So some of the bespoke training that we offer, it could be anything relating to your needs, but some of the ones we've done in the past include data storytelling, public speaking, assertiveness, stakeholder engagement, but we have technical training on AI, Excel, SQL, Python, Tableau, Power BI, and much more than that. So please do get in touch if this is of interest to you. So over the next 25 minutes or so, there's kind of three main areas I'd like us to cover. So why are we actually failing at communicating data effectively? What's going wrong and why is it going wrong? Number two is, why do stories influence us? But actually, what is happening to the brain when we hear stories? So understanding it on a more neurological level. I think it's really important for us to understand that. And most importantly, we will go through some tangible top tips on how you can start improving your data storytelling and therefore have more of an impact on stakeholders. So we're actually going to run through an example together and craft a story as a group with a specific insight in mind. If you have questions or any kind of ideas in the chat, please do put them in the chat and I'll get round to them if I can as well. So you may be thinking, a miscommunication here or there, it's not a huge deal. What will the odd slip up do? But actually, when you dive into the data, you can see the bigger picture and the real impact that this is having on business. So actually, a study was done looking at companies with companies that have more than 100,000 employees, and they cited that there was an average loss of $62.4 million per company per year. And this was due to inadequate communication to and between employees. So this is shocking when we think about the knock-on effects this will have and how else that money could have been used. It may also surprise you to hear that over 60% of analytics projects are failing. And some researchers say this is up to 85%. And this is actually predominantly due to, again, communication challenges. So we need to start considering why this is happening. What can we do to ensure these numbers are both reduced, and so data people like yourselves can start bringing more value to the workplace? So we know we're failing somewhere, and we know it's related to communication issues, but what specifically is going wrong? So for me, there's two main reasons. The first is that clear, actionable insights are not the end goal of your presentations. So meaning that when you're presenting your data, it's often not clear what should be actioned, but most importantly, why it should be actioned. It's not easy for your stakeholders to take action based on this because there is a lack of focus and a lack of business context. So often data people will present all of their data, be very descriptive, but not explain why and where that change is needed in that particular business. So this can be a real challenge. But secondly, insights are not being presented in a meaningful and engaging way. So meaning that even if it's clear to you as the data analyst what the insights are, and you know how urgent they are, it's not necessarily being translated in a way that the audience feels the urgency or feels a need to take action. So this is where stories might come into play and help us out. So if we want to understand how we can make a better impact with our audience, we need to take a step back and we need to look at how humans learnt to share and interpret information most effectively. So if we go back all the way to our ancestors, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we quickly see that storytelling was the number one way that we transferred information across generations. So we've been sharing information in this way for many years, and it's worked pretty well till now. Even as children, we were growing up hearing stories and telling stories, and I'm sure we can all remember an amazing book or a story that we read or heard as a child. So we know that we've used this and it's been important. However, the tool we're using most nowadays is PowerPoint, which was born 37 years ago. Obviously, PowerPoint has its advantages. I'm using it today to show you my presentation right now. But the problem is a lot of people make the mistake of using PowerPoint as a crutch. And they think this is all they need to use. Just put the data, put the numbers on a slide, and hope that will do the talking. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. So non-data literate people like myself don't naturally find numbers interesting. So the challenge you've got is, how can you use our evolution and modern day tools like PowerPoint to our advantage to make sure what we're presenting is engaging as possible? So you may be thinking from my previous slide that there's no real evidence to back this up. How do we know that stories are actually more impactful? Just because our ancestors used them, how is that impacting us today? So I wanted to dive into this a little bit further and think about brain scans that we see. When we look at brain scans, when people are hearing stories, the importance of this becomes clear. So if you think about all the information you have to process on a day-to-day basis, our brains are constantly having to decide what is worth converting from short-term memory to long-term memory and what we can disregard along the way. So actually, when our brains hear numbers and data, a very small part of our frontoparietal cortex is activated. However, when we hear stories, multiple parts of the brain are activating, so including the amygdala, which is involved in processing emotion, and also our mirror neurons, which play a role in empathizing with others. And actually, when multiple parts of our brain are being engaged, the brain assumes it's more worthy of being converted from short-term to long-term memory. So from these brain scans, it's very clear to us that brains prefer stories and they're more likely to be converted into longer-term memories and therefore more memorable to your stakeholders. So we know stories are impactful, we know they influence the brain, but what does data storytelling mean? To some of you, this should be quite straightforward, but data storytelling is the concept of building a compelling narrative based on a complex data set that helps you to tell your story and influence and inform particular audiences. So instead of just presenting your team with a spreadsheet of data and rattling off the numbers, it's about considering how can I engage multiple parts of their brain with a compelling narrative that's been crafted specifically for that audience in mind. It's about spending the time to think through this message. Will it land correctly with the audience? How can I influence them, encourage them to take action that I need them to? So where to start? My consultants often say to me, Liz, I finished analyzing my data, so I'm ready to present to you. And my first question back is, have you thought about your story? And probably 8 times out of 10, they will say, oh no, I haven't really got to that bit yet. And it almost feels like an afterthought to me. It's very common to finish analyzing your data, give yourself a pat on the back and say, kind of, you're done, there's nothing else to do. But for me, this is just the beginning of crafting your narrative. And it may seem really overwhelming at first, but I've got a couple of tips that should make this easier. So there's 2 questions you need to be able to answer before you do anything else. Number 1 is, what is the 1 or 2 things I need the audience to remember? If you don't know what the audience needs to remember, you've got no hope of them remembering potentially anything. So you need to make that really, really clear to yourself. Number 2 is, what 1 or 2 actions do I want the audience to take? Again, if you're not sure what action needs to be taken, you shouldn't be presenting anything at all, to be honest. If you're not clear what the action is, your audience will have no hope of doing anything about it. So those 2 questions need to be answered before you move on. You may be wondering why I've highlighted 1 or 2 and put it in bold. Actually, a big mistake that data people make is often overwhelming the audience with information. You need to minimize your audience's cognitive load as much as possible if you want them to do anything useful with your work. And a quote that I quite like is, "Simplicity changes behavior," which is so true. Make it easy for your audience to know what they should be doing after they've seen your presentation. And no matter how many cool insights you find, if they distract or dilute from those 1 or 2 things that you've recognized as being actions or things to remember, then you should scrap them. Save them for another presentation. Do not break this rule. And this is the number 1 piece of feedback I give my consultants when they're telling me a data story. So once you've answered that question, you should start, you've made a good start, so well done. But how can we now make a compelling narrative throughout the data? And there's kind of 6 key areas that I believe are essential in any data narrative to make it effective. So looking at, how do you hook an audience? How do you relate to the topic in the audience? How do you understand the business context and the needs of the business? How can you put the humans in the data and show vulnerability? How can you show common or shared goals with the audience? And finally, how can you make the audience feel good or hopeful at least once through your presentation? So these steps might seem quite vague right now, but what we're about to do is walk through an example together and actually craft some quotes and a story that you could use. It's much better for you to see how this works in practice rather than me just telling you on a higher level. So what I've done is, I've created a hypothetical scenario. So this is not any kind of real research. This is kind of what I've made up for the sake of practicing. So the task might be, as a data analyst, you might be asked to analyze a data set and provide insights. In this case, the audience you're presenting to is the senior health advisor at Public Health England, and you're aware that they're in charge of policy and budgets. The insight that you find from analysing the data is that elderly people in the northwest of England have significantly higher rates of anxiety. So what we're about to do is go through these 6 steps with this insight in mind and with this audience in mind, and actually think, how could this look? And what sort of things might we say? So we're going to start with hook. How can we hook an audience? So you have about 30 to 60 seconds before your audience decides if you're worth listening to or not, which is pretty intimidating. So you need to hook them as early as possible to grab their attention. The mistake people make is that actually they bore the audience early on, and therefore when the insights are interesting later, it's too late. So one way we can do this is by trying to activate that emotional response that we spoke about. So getting the mirror neurons involved, getting the amygdala lighting up. How can we do this? If you have any ideas, I would love you to put this in the chat. I've got a few things that I'm going to share with you in a moment, but there's hundreds of things you could do here. So I'd love to hear from people who have experience in this area, and then I will walk through mine in a moment once you've had a little bit of a think. So some of my ideas are actually asking rhetorical questions. So for example, in this case, with this insight in mind, you might ask the audience, why should people suffer just because of the location that they live in? So the reason this is powerful is it gets the audience thinking. Most good people will agree that this is an unfair statement. Therefore, they're invested emotionally and they want to know more. Why should people suffer just because they live? Surely that's not fair. And you get the audience questioning it early on. Secondly, a good technique is to shock the audience. Actually using potentially quite shocking or scary statistics early on can be quite powerful. So in this case, you might say something like, A shocking 1/3 of our elderly people in the Northwest are suffering with chronic anxiety, and this is 25% higher than the rest of the UK. So actually sparking some type of emotional response, again, which is more likely to be remembered. And finally, my favorite thing, but using emotive language when presenting. Using emotive language highlights to the audience what's important and where the urgency is. If you're just making statements and being very descriptive without any emotion tied into it, it's very easy for your audience to not hear or detect urgency, and therefore they don't feel any desire to make a change, which is the reason why you're there. So using these three kind of techniques with this insight would be pretty powerful. Someone in the chat has put relevant quotes from a memorable person. Definitely. So if you can think of it maybe as a celebrity or someone who's big in that field, that can be really, really useful. And actually someone else saying having a good visual representation. Yeah, perfect. Having visual aids instead of just numbers can be really powerful. Again, it lights up a different part of your brain. Okay, moving on to relating. So it's absolutely vital that you know who your audience are in advance. And you need to put the time to understand what their needs and interests are. Everything you do after that should be tailored to that audience in particular. So your story should be so specific that you couldn't keep telling it again and again to multiple audiences because it wouldn't be relevant. So how can we do that with this audience in mind? We know that our audience is the senior health advisor in charge of policy and budgets. So what could we actually do to hook this audience in particular? So we need to be thinking about their role, what are they in charge of, and their emotions. So again, have a little bit of a think. There's loads of things you could do here, and then I will share some ideas as well. So first things first, I would get them emotionally invested in the topic. So actually, can you get them to relate to this topic in particular on a personal level? So you might ask something like, do you know anyone who suffers with anxiety? So 1/4 of people struggle with mental health in some capacity. So there's a very good chance that some of you here in this audience today will be able to relate to this. The reason that's so powerful is by doing this, the audience is immediately thinking of themselves, or they're thinking about someone in their family or friends that they can relate to, and they can see the challenges that they're facing. Secondly, understanding what your audience care about. So in particular, their role in the business, why it matters to them. So in this case, we know our stakeholder is in charge of budget and policy. So I would immediately be thinking about the financial implications of anxiety. So actually stating something like the cost of reactive mental health care is increasing at an alarming rate. It needs to directly impact that person's role for them to feel a sense of urgency so that they can actually action it. And finally, naming the audience's pain. If you do the research and know what your audience cares about, you're going to get that buy-in much quicker. So in this case, it might be understanding that the government is under extreme pressure with mental health at the moment, and actually knowing that this person is under pressure to act quickly and naming that pain for them. In the chat, emotion is coming up a lot, so that's great. And yeah, using relatable examples is really important. Number 3 is looking at the business context. We need to fully understand how and why our insights impact the audience and the business. So kind of relates to, well, it's similar to relating, but what are the business needs here? So what can we do to make sure that the audience is fully aware of what's happening and what the implications are? So some of the things that I think about here is including sufficient context of the data. This one might seem obvious, but actually you'd be surprised how many people miss this out. If you've been looking at your data set for weeks and weeks and you know it inside out, it's very easy for you to make an assumption that everyone else knows what you're doing and what you're talking about. But if you're jumping straight into your insights because you're excited by them and they're really important, you're missing context, and your audience is going to have to work harder to understand what's happening and why. And if an audience has to work harder, their mental load increases and they will switch off and they will just completely miss your insights. So just something as simple as setting context. In this case, you would simply state, I was tasked with understanding equality in mental health services. My data set looks specifically at anxiety rates in elderly individuals. Just set the scene, make it easy for them. Secondly, don't just assume the audience knows how it impacts the business. So actually understanding, just because again, you know what the data is saying, don't assume they know what to do with it. So in this case, you might say, elderly people in the Northwest are disadvantaged, and it's critical for you to step in to ensure policy is updated and budget is allocated accordingly. If we don't act now, we might lose the public's trust. So again, making it super clear why this matters to the business. Next step is looking at the humans in the data. This is probably my favorite part of data storytelling. But actually, when we're looking at big data sets with thousands of rows, we can often forget that data relates to individual people, like our friends and our family. And it's very easy to forget to put the vulnerability into the data and show what the data actually means. It's very hard for our audience to relate to numbers, but it's very easy for us to relate to people. So how can we show vulnerability in our data sets? What can we do? So any ideas, please put them in the chat. So with this insight in particular. So some of my thoughts are actually showing vulnerability first as a speaker. It's always really helpful if the audience can relate to you or feel personally connected to you in some capacity. So if you have any experience personally with a topic that you're talking about or can relate to it, if you're comfortable in sharing that, I think it's very powerful. So in this case, you might say something like, actually, from a personal perspective, I can relate to this topic and I understand the challenges it presents. And this can be done with any kind of data. If you have a connection at all, I would strongly recommend being open about it. Your audience will feel like they can trust you, and therefore they will kind of take what you're saying with more kind of urgency, I suppose. And secondly, probably a bit more obvious, is actually put the humans in the data. Use case studies. It's really powerful. So in this case, you might simply say, actually, Sandy, 70 years old from Manchester, is suffering from chronic anxiety. She's actually been unable to work, and her daughter is now her full-time carer. So simply reminding them that this data is not just data points in Excel, it's people's lives and it means something. Number 5 is shared goals. So when you're looking for stakeholders to take action, a really powerful technique is to look at what you have in common with your audience. What shared goals do you have? And how can you make you feel like you're a team? You don't want to be blaming your audience or your stakeholder, because if the audience feels like the onus is on them and it's their problem, they need to fix it, they may be defensive and become withdrawn, and therefore no action will take place. It's far more powerful to think about how you can work together and create an in-group almost with you and the audience. So have a little think about what you could do in this scenario to make the audience feel like a team. So some really powerful techniques is using inclusive language. So actually stating that you and the audience are a team. So actually saying something like, we are struggling with mental health rates across the UK. It's important that we come together to address it. I'm not saying you have messed up, you've not put budget in the right place, you need to fix this. I'm saying that actually we both care about this, let's work together to fix it. And secondly, highlight shared interests. So actually your audience will feel like you have something in common if you can state this. So in this case, if you're both working at Public Health England, you might simply state that our mission at Public Health England is to protect and improve the nation's health and to address inequalities. And we're all invested in ensuring that this insight is actioned as a result. Simply stating that you both have that in common together. Okay, and finally, you really want the audience to feel good or at least hopeful at one point in the presentation. no matter how sad the data is or the insights are, you need to make them feel like there is some hope, because you don't want them to feel like there's no point actioning anything and it's hopeless. So how can we provide some hope here with this insight in mind? Again, final chance, have a think, and any ideas, put them in the chat, please. I can see in the chat someone saying about kind of the positive feelings of solving a problem. So that could be really good, highlighting, yeah, it's a problem right now, but if we work together and brainstorm, it will feel really good. So actually maybe highlighting positive emotions that might come from it. So some of my ideas are actually show the audience what equality in healthcare might look like. So let's say, for example, in your data set, you find that the northeast of England are actually noticing improvements. Highlight that as a case study. So in the northeast of England, there are small improvements due to this change in policy. And actually bringing it back to the humans, Sandy's quality of life could be improved drastically if we take similar action in the northwest and we invest further. So here I'm demonstrating that it's been done and it's been successful elsewhere. Let's do it over here. Let's do it in the northwest. That can be really powerful. Or simply contain a lesson for the audience, actually showing them, okay, there are ways we can fix this. Don't worry, it's not completely hopeless. Here are some of the ways we can address the issue, and then state them if you feel like you're able to do so. I'm just looking in the chat right now. Leave some quick wins along the way. Yeah, that's really useful. What are the kind of shorter term things we can do? We might not be able to fix it right now, but how can we have some quick wins? And include names on presentations and make references to them throughout. Yeah, almost keeping a case study throughout can be really useful, because the audience then can connect that person along the way. Okay, thank you guys. I hope that was useful to see how those steps can be useful with a real life insight. So now every time you present data, I'd love you to come back to these 6 areas and try to incorporate as many of them as possible. Even if you just have 2 or 3 of these in your presentation, I promise you, you will be far more successful and memorable to your stakeholder. So I'm going to finish with kind of a common question that I get asked a lot, and I'm sure some of you will probably be thinking it in the chat. How can you tell a story when the insights are less emotional? So obviously, when we're talking about rates of anxiety and mental health, it's obvious how to make it more emotive. And I'm well aware of that. And actually, I want to highlight the point that you can make a story out of any data set. The thing is, you have to put the time and effort in. The story isn't going to come straight away. It can take a couple of hours before you even see a story coming together. But it's about investing the time. When you know what the business needs are, you know who the stakeholders are, and you know what they respond to, and you've done that research, your story can then be crafted around them, and it can relate to absolutely anything. I've even used some elements of data storytelling in my presentation right now. For example, I hooked you at the start with some quotes. I shocked you with some of the costs of poor communication. I've related to your needs as data people, and I've hopefully given you hope that you can improve your presentations going forward. And I haven't actually got a data set to show you. So hopefully you can see that this can be used anywhere. At Rockborne, we look at this in detail, and we look at complex data sets that are not quite so obvious as this. So if this is something that you're thinking about with you and your team, and you might be interested in more support in this area, please do reach out directly either to me or any of the Rockborne team, and I would love to speak to you about it further. So to summarize what we've covered today, some key takeaways for you. Stories are more impactful than numbers. They should be used at any time when you're presenting data in any capacity, but particularly when you want to see behavior change or action implemented in some way. Understanding your insights first is absolutely crucial. You need to know what you want the audience to remember and what should be actioned. Simplicity changes behavior. Keep your insights simple, 1 or 2 max per presentation. Don't be tempted to throw everything you've got in it. And finally, time invested in crafting your story is not a waste. It may be the difference between someone actioning your insights and not actioning them. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your engagement in the chat. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer, but if not, please do reach out directly.